story contains complex conflicts and sensitive situations. Viewer discretion is advised.
The ledger didn't slip out of her hands. She swung it. It was just after 3 on a Thursday afternoon in March, inside my father's office at Harper & Cole Building Supply on the west side of Columbus. The door was half closed the way he preferred during end-of-quarter reviews. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I remember that clearly because I was looking down at the vendor summary when the hard edge of the company ledger struck the side of my head. It wasn't dramatic. It was blunt. A heavy binder thick with printed financials and handwritten notations driven forward with enough force to make me lose my balance against Dad's bookcase. By the time I straightened up, my sister had already stepped back. She was breathing hard, but her face had settled into something almost neutral. The ledger lay open on the floor between us, pages bent at the corners. We weren't arguing about family. We were arguing about numbers. I'm 32 years old, the operations manager in the company my father started 35 years ago. My older sister Denise runs sales. For the past week, I had been reviewing bonus allocations tied to vendor incentives. A few adjustments in the ledger didn't align with the approval trail in our accounting software. They weren't small rounding errors. They shifted profit distribution within her department. That afternoon, I brought the printed summaries into Dad's office because I wanted it on record. He was at a contractor meeting across town, and I thought it would be better to leave the documents on his desk rather than discuss it in the hallway. Denise followed me in. She closed the door most of the way and said I was overstepping. I said the numbers required clarification. She picked up the ledger to show me where she'd made corrections. I reached for the page. That's when she swung it. There was no one else in the room. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't shove her back. I stood there trying to understand how a dispute about bonus calculations had turned physical in my father's office. Denise bent down, picked up the ledger, and walked out without another word. I stayed behind long enough to steady myself. The side of my head throbbed, but there was no blood. The bookcase behind me had shifted slightly. One framed supplier awards hung crooked. I adjusted it before I left. By the next morning, my keycard wouldn't unlock the accounting suite. The email from IT was brief. Access to payroll and vendor disbursement modules had been temporarily suspended pending internal review. Security was preserving camera logs from the executive corridor. HR requested I attend a meeting at 10. Attached to the message was a copy of a written incident report. It stated that on Thursday afternoon, I had confronted my sister in Dad's office and physically advanced toward her in an aggressive manner. It said she feared for her safety and used the ledger to shield herself. There was a timestamp. There was her signature. There was a line noting that witnesses were being interviewed. I read it twice before I called HR. The receptionist transferred me directly to Melissa Grant, our HR manager. She told me the company was obligated to follow procedure when a written complaint alleging workplace violence was filed. She said both parties would be placed on temporary operational restriction until the matter was reviewed. Both parties, but only one of us had lost system access. At 10, I walked past the warehouse floor and into the conference room beside accounting. A few employees looked up and then quickly looked away. Payroll had to run that afternoon. My name was on the approval chain. Dad arrived last. He didn't look at me first. He looked at the folder in front of Melissa. Denise sat across from me, composed hands folded over a legal pad. The ledger wasn't there. It had already been returned to the finance cabinet. Dad said the company couldn't afford instability in leadership. He said the report had to be taken seriously. He said this would be handled according to policy. No one asked me what happened in the office. No one asked why the framed award on the bookcase had been crooked. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. I was instructed not to access financial systems until further notice. Security would complete a review of camera footage from the hallway. I was not to discuss the incident with staff. When I left the room, Denise remained seated beside Dad. By noon, word had traveled through the building. I could feel it in the way vendors' calls were routed around me. I could see it in the accounting team's posture when I passed their desks. The ledger was back in its cabinet. The adjustments inside it were still there. The question wasn't just what happened in that office. It was who would be believed in the record that followed. And by Friday afternoon, the record no longer belonged to me. Friday moved like a normal workday for everyone except me. Payroll was scheduled for release at 2 in the afternoon. For the past 4 years, I had been the final approval in the system before funds were transmitted through our regional bank. By 9, I was already aware that my credentials were no longer recognized by the accounting platform. The login screen simply redirected me to a restricted access notice. I drove to the office anyway. Harper & Cole sits between a plumbing supplier and a tire distributor, the warehouse doors rolling up by 7 each morning. The parking lot was nearly full when I arrived. Nothing about the building suggested disruption. Forklifts were moving pallets. Delivery trucks were lining up near the dock. Inside, the accounting suite door that normally opened to my keycard stayed locked. Tom Alvarez from IT met me in the hallway outside the server closet. He carried a tablet and avoided prolonged eye contact. He said access had been suspended under directive from HR and executive review. The phrase sounded rehearsed. He also mentioned that all activity logs tied to the executive corridor and Dad's office were being copied to a secure drive. He did not say what they showed. I walked back through the main office floor without entering accounting. A few employees paused mid-conversation as I passed. Payroll questions were already circulating. Our controller, Margaret Lee, stood by her desk, reviewing printed summaries. She had always routed final confirmations through me. That afternoon, she was waiting on someone else. At 11, a calendar update appeared on my phone. A temporary authorization had been granted to Denise to approve payroll disbursements for this cycle only. The note cited continuity of operations. Continuity. The same morning, I was told both parties were under restriction. One of us had been reassigned authority. I checked my company email. Vendor correspondence that normally required my oversight had been forwarded to a shared executive inbox. My signature block had been removed from an automated approval chain. There was no formal notice of suspension, no termination letter, just a series of operational adjustments that narrowed my role hour by hour. Shortly before noon, security requested that I surrender my secondary building key, used for after-hours reconciliations. The request was framed as temporary standard procedure while internal review was ongoing. I handed it over at the reception desk. From the mezzanine above the warehouse floor, I could see Denise walking alongside Dad toward the sales wing. She carried a binder under her arm. She did not look toward the accounting offices. At 2 o'clock, payroll processed without my authorization. Employees received their deposits. Trucks continued to move. The company functioned. By the end of the day, my responsibilities had been redistributed in practice, even if not in title. The ledger adjustments we had argued over remained in place inside the cabinet. The incident report remained on file with HR. The camera footage was somewhere on a secured drive I could not access. Nothing dramatic had happened in public view, but the authority I had built over a decade in the business had been paused in less than 24 hours, and I had no control over how that pause would be recorded. Monday morning, the executive conference room felt colder than it had on Friday. The blinds were half drawn against a pale sky, and the long walnut table had been cleared except for 3 folders placed at measured intervals. My name was typed on a white tent card in front of one of them. Denise's was across from mine. Dad sat at the head of the table, not in his usual relaxed posture, but upright, both hands flat on the surface. To his right were the 2 outside board members, men who had joined the company years ago to provide independent oversight. At the far end sat an attorney I recognized from the previous compliance updates. I had never spoken to her directly before. No one mentioned the warehouse payroll or vendor calls. The meeting opened with a summary of the written complaint. It was read aloud in neutral language. The words were stripped of tone, but they carried weight. Allegation of aggressive conduct. Physical advancement. Defensive action. The attorney explained that when a workplace violence claim is formally filed, the company is obligated to review it under established policy. That review would include documentation interviews and examination of any relevant footage. Until the review concluded, both parties would be placed on temporary restriction from sensitive operational authority. Sensitive operational authority. Dad repeated that phrase once, as if to underline it. He said the company's responsibility was to stability and fairness, not to personal loyalties. He said decisions had to be insulated from emotion. I watched him as he spoke. He did not look at me. A memo was slid across the table outlining the interim structure. Payroll and vendor approvals would route through a shared executive account overseen by the board. Neither Denise nor I would hold independent sign-off authority during the review period. Department heads would report directly to Dad. On paper, it appeared balanced. In practice, Denise still controlled the sales pipeline and client relationships. I was barred from the financial systems that defined my role. The attorney requested written statements from both of us by end of day Wednesday. HR would schedule individual interviews with staff who had been in proximity to the executive corridor on Thursday afternoon. Security would complete its preservation of camera data. No one asked me to describe what happened. Instead, I was asked to confirm that I understood the temporary restrictions and would comply with them. I signed the acknowledgement form. After the meeting adjourned, the board members left first. The attorney followed. Denise gathered her folder and stepped out without pausing. Dad remained seated. For a moment, I thought he might ask me privately. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the memorandum again, and said the company could not afford uncertainty at the top. Then he stood and walked toward the sales wing. By mid-afternoon, department managers had received notice of the interim reporting changes. My calendar access to certain financial review meetings was revoked. A weekly budget call I had chaired for years was reassigned to an operations consultant. Nothing in writing stated guilt. Nothing restored my authority either. The shift was procedural, orderly, and public. By the end of Monday, it was clear that whatever had happened in that office on Thursday had moved beyond a family dispute. It now existed in board minutes, policy language, and compliance timelines. And in that format, the question was no longer who raised a ledger. It was whether I could remain credible inside the structure my father built. By Tuesday afternoon, my name had disappeared from 3 more recurring meetings. No announcement was made. The calendar simply adjusted itself. A budget reconciliation call I used to run was now listed under a shared executive account. A quarterly forecasting session showed Denise and Dad as primary hosts. I wasn't being escorted out of the building. I still had an office. I still had a title. But the scope of it was shrinking in ways that were measurable. Late that day, Margaret from accounting forwarded me a draft vendor incentive summary with a brief note for your reference only. My approval line had been removed, but she knew I had built the spreadsheet template years ago. I opened the attachment at my desk, careful not to log into restricted systems. The document was a static export, not live data. The incentive allocations for the first quarter were laid out in columns. Supplier rebates, departmental bonus percentages, projected distribution. The adjustments I had questioned on Thursday were still there. They weren't random. 2 mid-sized suppliers with recent volume increases showed revised rebate recognition dates. The changes accelerated the revenue into the current quarter. That shift inflated the performance metrics tied to sales bonuses. Denise's department. The numbers were clean on the surface, no missing funds, no obvious discrepancies, but the timing mattered. Accelerated recognition meant higher short-term payouts, even if the long-term totals balanced out. I cross-referenced the figures with printed vendor agreements I kept in my filing cabinet. Those contracts specified rebate eligibility based on verified shipment completion, not invoicing date. The shipment reports I had reviewed earlier in the week did not align with the accelerated entries. The disagreement in Dad's office had started with that distinction. I printed the relevant pages and placed them in a manila folder. I did not walk them to Dad's desk. Instead, I requested a formal data extract from IT documenting user-level changes to the accounting system over the past 30 days. I framed it as preparation for my written statement due Wednesday. Tom responded within an hour. The audit log would be compiled but would need executive authorization before release. Executive authorization. By early evening, I received an email from HR confirming my interview slot for Thursday morning. The message outlined confidentiality expectations and reiterated that retaliation of any kind would not be tolerated. Retaliation. The word lingered longer than the rest. On Wednesday, I arrived before 8 and reviewed archived board packets from prior quarters stored in the internal drive I still had limited access to. Historical bonus calculations showed consistent recognition timing in line with shipment verification. The recent shifts stood out. Around 10, I saw Denise in the corridor speaking with our largest regional contractor. Their conversation was animated but controlled. When she noticed me, she didn't pause or change tone. She continued outlining projected supply timelines for summer builds. Client confidence appeared intact. At noon, Dad circulated a short internal update to department heads, emphasizing stability and urging teams to focus on performance metrics amid temporary governance adjustments. He did not mention the complaint directly. By mid-afternoon, the audit log extract arrived in my inbox, copied to Dad and the board attorney. It listed timestamps and user IDs tied to system entries. The adjustments to rebate recognition dates had been made under Denise's credentials, late on Wednesday night, 2 days before the incident in his office. There was no commentary attached, just data. I printed the log and added it to the folder with the vendor agreements and the incentive summary. The stack was growing, but it wasn't yet a conclusion. The complaint against me remained active. My system access remained restricted. The interim governance structure remained in place. But the disagreement in that office no longer looked like a spontaneous conflict. It looked like a sequence, and sequences can be documented. Thursday began with my HR interview. Melissa sat across from me in a smaller conference room this time, a digital recorder placed between us. She asked structured questions about the timeline in Dad's office, my physical position in the room, my tone, whether I had made contact first. I answered each one carefully, sticking to sequence rather than interpretation. When it was over, she reminded me that the review was ongoing and that both parties remained under restriction. She did not comment on the audit log or the rebate entries. That was outside her scope. By late morning, I had finished my written statement. I attached the audit log extract, the vendor agreement excerpts, and the incentive summary showing the adjusted recognition dates. I did not accuse Denise of misconduct. I described the discrepancies, the contractual language, and the fact that the adjustments were made under her credentials 2 days before the incident. Instead of sending it only to HR, I addressed it to the full board, including the 2 independent members and the outside attorney. In the subject line, I used a neutral phrase, request for independent financial review and data preservation. I outlined one specific action, that the company engage an external auditing firm to review the recent rebate recognition changes and confirm compliance with vendor contracts and internal policy. I also requested that all relevant financial data and camera footage be formally preserved to prevent alteration during the review period. I reread the email twice. Once it was sent, it could not be recalled or reframed as a misunderstanding between siblings. It would become part of the company's official record distributed beyond the executive suite. I pressed send. Within an hour, a calendar invitation appeared for a special board session the following Tuesday. The meeting title was Brief Governance Review. Dad's assistant confirmed that an outside auditing firm would be contacted for a preliminary assessment. IT received a directive to preserve all accounting system backups for the past quarter. Denise forwarded my email back to me with the board copied. Her message was short. She characterized my request as an escalation that could damage vendor relationships and create unnecessary exposure. She stated that any financial adjustments had been within her managerial discretion. She did not retract the incident report. By mid-afternoon, department heads were informed that an external review would take place. The language emphasized due diligence and fiduciary responsibility. Rumors moved faster than the memo. 2 sales managers stopped by my office separately to ask whether bonus payouts were at risk. I told them the review was procedural and that no decisions had been made. I did not promise anything more. Around 5, Dad knocked once on my doorframe before stepping inside. He did not sit. He said the board had a duty to protect the company's integrity. He said outside auditors would examine the numbers and that we would all have an opportunity to present our positions. He did not ask me to withdraw the request. He did not ask Denise to amend her complaint. After he left, I opened the shared executive inbox from a read-only terminal still accessible to me. A vendor had inquired about rebate confirmation timing for a March shipment. The question aligned exactly with the contracts I had cited. I printed the email and added it to the growing folder on my desk. By the end of the day, the issue had moved beyond an internal dispute over conduct. It now involved independent oversight, preserved data, and third-party review. The interim governance structure remained intact, my access was still restricted. Denise still controlled sales, but the company was no longer evaluating only whether I had advanced toward her in an office. It was preparing to examine the numbers that preceded that moment. That shift was no longer reversible. The following Monday, security requested that both Denise and I make ourselves available for a brief review session. It wasn't framed as an interrogation. It was described as a confirmation of preserved footage before the board meeting scheduled for Tuesday. The request came through email from our facilities manager copying HR and the board attorney. The review took place in a small monitoring room behind the warehouse offices, the kind typically used for checking loading dock activity after hours. A single wall-mounted screen displayed the executive corridor feed from the previous Thursday afternoon. The timestamp was visible in the upper right corner. I stood with my back to the door. Denise remained near the table beneath the monitor. Tom from IT operated the playback system. Melissa from HR observed quietly holding a notepad. The footage began several minutes before the time listed in the incident report. It showed the corridor outside Dad's office. Staff moved past at intervals. A sales associate entered a conference room down the hall. At 3:07 p.m., Denise walked into frame carrying the company ledger tucked under her arm. She paused briefly outside Dad's office, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. No one else entered after her. At 3:11 p.m., the door opened again. Denise exited first, holding the ledger. Her posture was steady. She walked down the corridor toward HR. I appeared in the frame several seconds later, adjusting my jacket and closing the office door behind me. I did not follow her. The footage contained no audio. It did not show what happened inside the room. But the sequence did not match the narrative in the written complaint. According to the report, I had advanced toward her in an aggressive manner, prompting her to defend herself and exit the office for safety. The corridor video showed her entering alone and leaving without visible distress before I emerged. Tom paused the playback and enlarged the timestamp. The metadata confirmed the recording had been archived the same evening it was captured. Melissa asked whether either of us disputed the authenticity of the footage. Denise said the camera did not capture what occurred inside the office. She stated that fear does not always appear on video. No one argued that the timestamps were inaccurate. The session lasted less than 30 minutes. When it ended, Melissa indicated that the footage would be appended to the internal review file and shared with the board in advance of Tuesday's meeting. That afternoon, an updated memo was circulated to department heads, noting that the review was expanding to include corridor footage and system access logs to ensure a complete record. The language was careful. By evening, I received a brief message from Denise, copied to the board. She reiterated that the financial adjustments had been within her managerial authority, and that my request for an external audit was disproportionate to the issue at hand. She also maintained that the physical incident remained a separate matter. She did not request that the footage be withheld. The next morning before the board session, Dad stopped by my office for the first time since Thursday. He did not mention the camera directly. He asked whether I was prepared to present the financial documentation I had submitted. I told him I was. The corridor footage had not restored my system access. It had not removed the complaint from my file, but it altered the frame. The question was no longer confined to a private account of behavior inside a closed office. There was now a documented sequence of entry and exit times preserved on record that would sit beside the written report and the audit logs. For the first time since Friday, the timeline was no longer controlled by a single signature. The board session on Tuesday began at 9 sharp. An outside auditing firm had joined by video conference from Cincinnati. The lead partner introduced himself briefly, then moved directly into a preliminary summary. The tone was measured, technical, and detached from the family dynamics that had colored the past week. He explained that their team had reviewed rebate recognition entries, vendor contracts, shipment confirmations, and user-level access logs covering the previous quarter. The findings were not dramatic in language. Several rebate entries had been recognized prior to verified shipment completion, contrary to contract terms. The adjustments were not illegal on their face, but they did not align with documented policy. The accelerated recognition increased reported quarterly performance in the sales division and directly affected bonus calculations. Denise's department. The auditor emphasized that the issue was one of internal control consistency and fiduciary oversight. The financial totals for the year would likely reconcile over time, but the timing created a distortion in short-term performance metrics. The board members asked whether the entries could have been administrative error. The auditor responded that the user credentials associated with the changes were consistent, and that the adjustments required deliberate entry rather than automated processing. Denise requested an opportunity to respond. She stated that vendor relationships often required flexible interpretation of recognition timing, and that her department operated under pressure to meet quarterly targets set by the board itself. She characterized the issue as a judgment call within managerial discretion. The incident in Dad's office was not mentioned in detail, but the board attorney noted that the complaint and the financial review now existed in parallel within the same governance record. Dad remained quiet for most of the discussion. When the session recessed for a short break, I stepped into the hallway outside the conference room. Two department heads were waiting at the far end, their conversation hushed. News had already begun circulating that the auditors had identified irregular timing. Inside the room, the board reconvened and moved to consider interim safeguards. A proposal was introduced to suspend independent sign-off authority for all bonus-related adjustments, pending a restructuring of approval controls. An external CFO candidate was mentioned as a possible addition to the leadership team. None of those measures singled me out. None restored my authority either. Before adjournment, the board requested that Denise provide written clarification regarding the rationale for the timing adjustments and any communication with vendors related to those decisions. The deadline was set for the end of the week. As we left the room, Denise did not look at me. By mid-afternoon, an internal communication informed managers that bonus calculations for the quarter would be temporarily deferred, pending completion of the governance review. The message referenced due diligence and long-term stability. Sales managers began forwarding questions about projected payouts. In the warehouse, I overheard a supervisor telling a crew lead that leadership was under review. The phrase carried more weight than the specifics. Later that day, I received a notice from HR, reminding both parties that the workplace conduct review remained open and that confidentiality was required. The two tracks, financial oversight and conduct allegation, were now moving at the same time. The camera timeline, the audit logs, and the external findings had tightened the frame, but they had not yet resolved it. By evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Denise, not copied to the board this time. She stated that escalating the matter externally risked damaging the company my father built, and that some things should have been handled internally as family. I did not respond. The next board session was scheduled for the following Monday. Between now and then, the company would continue operating under interim controls. Bonuses were paused. Authority was diffused. Reputations were suspended in place. The pressure was no longer confined to an office or a corridor camera. It was distributed across contracts, pay structures, and the future shape of the business. And there was still no resolution. The following Monday, the conference room filled earlier than usual. The outside auditor was present in person this time, seated beside the board attorney. A draft resolution lay in front of each board member. I recognized the format from prior governance updates, but this one carried more weight. Denise arrived last. She placed a typed statement on the table before sitting down. The board chair, one of the independent members, opened the session. He summarized the written clarification Denise had submitted over the weekend. She maintained that the rebate timing adjustments were strategic decisions made under sales pressure and that no funds had been misappropriated. She acknowledged that the entries deviated from prior practice, but argued they were justified by competitive realities. The auditor was asked whether the explanation altered their findings. He responded that managerial discretion did not override contract language or documented internal controls. He reiterated that the entries had accelerated revenue recognition and affected bonus calculations in measurable ways. The board attorney then addressed the workplace conduct review. She stated that the corridor footage and the absence of corroborating witness accounts did not support the claim that I had advanced toward Denise in an aggressive manner as described in the report. The matter would remain in the file, but no disciplinary action was recommended based on available evidence. The room was quiet when she finished. The resolution was read aloud. Effective immediately, Denise would be relieved of independent authority over rebate recognition and bonus-related adjustments, pending a full restructuring of financial controls. An interim operations oversight committee would assume supervisory responsibility for sales-related financial entries. The company would engage an external CFO on a contract basis to implement revised approval protocols. The incident report would be reclassified as unsubstantiated for disciplinary purposes. The vote was taken in sequence. Each board member stated their position for the record. The resolution passed. Dad was the last to speak. He voted in favor. Denise did not argue once the vote concluded. She gathered her statement and left the room without addressing anyone directly. Afterward, the board attorney handed me a copy of the revised interim governance structure. My system access would not be fully restored yet, but I would resume participation in financial review meetings under the new controls. It was not a return to the previous arrangement. It was a new one. By early afternoon, a formal internal memo announced leadership adjustments and the engagement of an external financial executive. The language focused on strengthening compliance and safeguarding long-term stability. The memo did not mention the conflict in Dad's office. In the sales wing, doors remained closed longer than usual. In accounting, conversations resumed at a cautious volume. When I returned to my office, I found that my access to the shared executive dashboard had been partially reinstated. The permissions were limited but functional. A calendar invitation for a joint oversight meeting appeared for Wednesday. No one congratulated me. No one apologized either. The complaint had not vanished from history, but it no longer defined the record. The rebate entries were no longer insulated by departmental authority. An outside financial officer would soon be examining every approval pathway. The company had shifted course. And for the first time since that Thursday afternoon, the direction of that shift was not determined by a single report. By Wednesday, the new controls were no longer theoretical. An interim oversight committee met at 8 that morning in the smaller strategy room adjacent to the executive suite. I was there along with one independent board member, the outside attorney, and a consultant introduced as Daniel Mercer, the contract's CFO, retained to implement revised financial protocols. He had spent the previous 48 hours reviewing system permissions, approval chains, and departmental workflows. His tone was direct and unadorned. He outlined immediate changes, dual authorization required for all rebate recognition entries, centralized documentation of vendor communications affecting financial timing, and removal of individual discretion over bonus impacting adjustments. Denise's seat at the table remained, but her access credentials were displayed on a screen showing reduced permissions within the accounting system. There was no accusation in the room, only structure. Daniel requested a complete mapping of sales-driven revenue recognition practices over the past 12 months. He assigned responsibility for compiling that data to the sales operations manager rather than Denise herself. She objected, once noting that operational efficiency would suffer if her department's authority was fragmented. The board member responded that governance stability outweighed short-term efficiency. The decision was recorded. Later that afternoon, an amended employment agreement was circulated for Denise to review. It formalized the temporary removal of independent financial authority and set conditions for reinstatement contingent upon compliance with revised controls. She did not sign it immediately. In the accounting department, new approval workflows were activated. Margaret walked me through the updated dashboard access now available to me. My role had shifted from sole approver to co-reviewer under the new oversight model. The change did not restore what had existed before. It replaced it with a monitored framework. By Friday, vendors received standardized communication clarifying that rebate recognition would follow contractual shipment verification without exception. The message carried Daniel's name alongside Dad's. Internally, bonus calculations remained paused, pending recalibration under the new controls. The atmosphere in the building was different. Conversations were shorter. Doors stayed closed longer. In the sales wing, I noticed that Denise's office door now required scheduling through a shared calendar rather than open walk-ins. Client calls were being documented in a central log reviewed weekly by the oversight committee. The authority she once exercised informally had become conditional and visible. That evening, Dad asked me to stay after the oversight meeting. He remained standing near the conference table, reviewing the revised governance chart projected on the screen. He said the company would move forward under the new structure. He acknowledged that reliance on trust alone had been insufficient. He did not frame it as apology. He did not frame it as victory either. When I left the building, the parking lot was nearly empty. The warehouse lights were dimmed for the night. The complaint that had initiated this sequence still existed in the record. The family dynamic had not been resolved. But Denise's independent authority over the financial levers tied to performance and bonuses was gone. The system no longer relied on discretion. It relied on verification. And that shift carried consequences that would not disappear at the end of a quarter. 3 weeks later, the contract was finalized. It wasn't dramatic. No announcement was made beyond a standard internal memo confirming the restructuring of executive roles and the formal appointment of Daniel as interim CFO through the end of the fiscal year. Attached to that memo was an updated leadership chart. Denise's title had been revised. She remained head of sales, but financial authority over rebate recognition and bonus calculations was permanently transferred to the oversight framework. All compensation adjustments would require dual authorization, one from finance and one from the board liaison. The incident report remained archived, marked as unsubstantiated for disciplinary purposes. On a Thursday morning in April, I sat across from our corporate attorney to review my own amended employment agreement. The document clarified my scope under the new governance model. I would serve as Director of Operations and Finance Integration, reporting jointly to Dad and the Board Oversight Committee. My compensation structure was adjusted to reflect performance metrics tied to compliance and internal controls, not departmental rivalry. A clause was added requiring directors to carry professional liability coverage funded by the company. I signed it. The role was not the same one I had before. It was narrower in some ways and more exposed in others, but it was defined. That afternoon, Denise signed her amended agreement as well. She did not look toward my office when she left the attorney's conference room. We no longer passed each other in hallways without notice. Meetings were scheduled with clear agendas and recorded minutes. Client calls involving pricing incentives were logged and copied to finance. The structure did not repair our relationship. It replaced assumption with documentation. By early May, the external CFO completed his initial implementation report. Internal controls were documented, approval workflows, standardized, and vendor contract language cross-referenced in the accounting system. The board voted to retain him for an additional 6 months to oversee transition. Dad called a brief leadership meeting that Friday afternoon. He thanked the team for navigating a difficult period and emphasized that the company's reputation rested on transparency as much as growth. He did not single anyone out. Afterward, I returned to my office and closed the door. The building felt steadier than it had in weeks. The warehouse floor noise filtered up through the vents in its usual rhythm. Trucks continued arriving. Orders continued shipping. Denise and I still shared a last name on the company website. But authority now moved through structure, not assumption. I did not win anything in the sense people often mean. I did not regain what existed before that Thursday in March. What I gained was clarity in writing. My access was defined. My responsibilities were documented. My role was insulated by process rather than personal loyalty. At home that evening, I placed my amended contract in a fireproof folder and slid it into the drawer of my desk. It felt less like a trophy and more like a boundary. Staying in the company came with a cost. Family dinners were quieter, conversations narrower. The familiarity of shared history no longer softened disagreements. But the business my father built now operated under standards that did not depend on who was believed in a closed office. They depended on what could be verified. And that was enough for me. If you've ever had to choose between silence and documentation, between protecting a relationship and protecting your own name, I'd be interested to hear how you handled it. Share your experience in the comments if you feel comfortable. If this story resonated, consider subscribing or following along. There's another story ahead about family accountability and what it really costs to stay.